January 12, 1945. One of the fiercest offensives of World War II has just begun on the Eastern Front. In it, more than 2 million soldiers of the Red Army launch themselves against a German army that is completely crushed and that can do little or nothing to contain the Soviet onslaught. This operation was known as the Vistula-Oder Offensive, which ended with Stalin's troops less than 70 kilometers from Berlin by the end of January 1945. This was the first time that Red Army soldiers set foot inside the original border of the Third Reich, and with this, panic took over the German population. It is estimated that between 8 and 10 million German civilians undertook a desperate flight towards Berlin in order to escape the Soviet soldiers. This escape was totally disorganized, and with temperatures that reached 20 degrees below zero. Many of them died from cold, hunger, exhaustion, or bombings. Most of those left behind also did so at the hands of Soviet troops, who the moment they set foot in East Prussia, erupted in a seed of uncontrollable blood and vengeance. Without going into all the crimes and atrocities that occur, which we will soon see in a live program, we are going to analyze the reaction of the soldiers of the Red Army when they came face to face with German society and its way of life. What we are going to see below, without a doubt, is one of the greatest paradoxes of those times, which has gone quite unnoticed. According to Soviet correspondent Vasily Grossman himself, it all began when the frontline troops arrived at German soil. Suddenly, they began to realize that urban planning was quite different. They had been told for years that the Soviet Union represented paradise for the peasantry and the worker. Once they began to see the houses in the area, which were large, well-kept, and mostly had beautiful gardens, the Soviets believed that they were the homes of wealthy German barons. They quickly began to destroy and burn them, also destroying everything they found inside. Little by little, they realized that there could not be so many barons in Germany, since the vast majority of houses they encountered had these characteristics. However, this did not stop the destruction from stopping. Everything was consumed by flames in East Prussia, to such an extent that when night came, the soldiers barely had anywhere to go to shelter from the cold. It was later learned that in addition to the hatred they felt for the Germans, this destruction was also motivated so that the Soviet rear troops, as well as their senior officers, could not steal or take over anything when they reached their positions. They called them the vermin of the general staff and the vermin of the rear guard. Although in their countries most houses were made of wood, all the houses were made of brick and stone, with a garden full of well-trimmed hedges and excellent roads throughout the area. The Soviets were also surprised by the large number of pianos they found in practically every house and by the presence of radio sets. All these elements increasingly provoked a mixture of envy, confusion, anger, and admiration towards the Germans, which could hardly be controlled. They also felt deceived by their own leaders, realizing that many issues they had been telling them were lies. However, due to the feeling of revenge they felt towards the Germans, this was quickly redirected towards them. The question that many soldiers of the Red Army asked themselves, as they recorded in writing, was, why did these Germans who live so well invade us, if in our country compared to theirs, there is only misery? A Soviet soldier noted, how are we going to treat these Germans? They don't lack anything, they are well fed, they have good homes and livestock, they have orchards with apple trees, and they come and invade us. They even reached my city, more than 1,000 kilometers from here. For that alone, Captain, we should strangle them all. As expected, the ideological department of the Soviet Army soon paid attention to the different reports from postal censors, which warned that soldiers were writing many letters to their families in which they told them about this contrast in the standard of living. Although these soldiers did not do so with malicious intent, it was clear that this information, upon arriving home, could have an incorrect political interpretation. This meant that the postal censorship departments had to work overtime to hide all this information that the soldiers were writing in their letters. As an anecdote, here we have to include that due to the lack of paper that the soldiers had, they resorted to papers and postcards that they took from German houses, carrying many of these sheets of paper and anti-communist slogans that the Germans had. This caused the Soviet High Command to make an effort to send paper to the soldiers to write on so that situations of this type would not occur again. A striking event was that some soldiers who had never seen light bulbs because there was no electricity in their villages were amazed by this invention and stole them with the idea that they would also illuminate their homes. They clearly thought that they were not connected to anything and that the light came from inside the bulb itself. In addition, as Cornelius Ryan tells in his book, they also took griffins and other items with the same objective. Another fundamental aspect of this episode was the reaction that the Soviet authorities had with the prisoners of their state that they were releasing. These numbered in the millions and had fallen under German control during their advance in 1941 and 1942. This group of Soviets who found themselves in German territory was very heterogeneous. There were forced laborers, prisoners of war, and finally Soviets fighting on the German side. In addition to this group that fought with the Germans, most of whom were shot on the spot, the other two did not escape numerous punishments either. There are testimonies from many of them that describe that German treatment had been very harsh, but what their own compatriots now gave them was even worse. They were accused as traitors, deserters, collaborators, etc. Some men who could fight were incorporated into the Red Army to launch them in the last offensive towards Berlin. But despite this, after the battle, they were again detained and interrogated, many of them being sent to concentration camps along with those who had already been sent after being accused as traitors. The Soviet women who were held captive were also subjected to treatment quite similar to that of the Germans themselves, with all that this entails. On the other hand, the situation for the Germans at this time was the most critical they had experienced in the entire war. For the first time, waves of millions of people were desperately heading inside its borders. With them, they brought a few material belongings and their heartbreaking testimonies. Although many German defeats had been hidden from its population, as is customary for all countries to do when things are not going well, this catastrophe could not be contained. Although the news reports said that the fighting was taking place around Warsaw, the reality was that the front line had been completely overwhelmed in the first days of the offensive. The columns of Soviet armored vehicles advanced tens of kilometers a day towards Berlin, without anything being able to stop them. Once these refugees began to arrive, and with them the stories of the great atrocities that the Soviets were committing on children, young people, adults, and the elderly, as well as all their property, this catastrophe had to be made public. There was no other choice but to spread these stories officially and make the population understand the fate that awaited them if they were not able to overcome the situation. Either he would fight at the risk of dying, or he would surely die once the Soviets captured him if he surrendered. In a similar way to what Stalin did in the summer of 1942 with his famous order number 227, entitled "Not a Step Back," Himmler, who had been appointed commander of the Vistula Army Group, had to give an order identical to German troops. This order was called "Death and Punishment to Those Who Do Not Do Their Duty." Finally, after suffering enormous military and civilian losses, the Germans were able to consolidate a more or less stable front at the height of the Oder River by mid-February, awaiting the final Soviet onslaught.